Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you this morning to the session on the future of the NATO and on the Warsaw Summit 2016. I'm representing Atlantic Council in Poland. We are very happy to cooperate with the organizers of this forum. And before starting the discussion, let me just say that we're deeply grateful and we want to congratulate the organizers of this Warsaw Security Forum for making this such an extraordinary event in a map of conferences which are happening in Poland and in the region. And we know what we are saying, being the co-organizer of another annual conference in Wrocław Global Forum. We know how difficult it is to organize such an event, especially when you have such a transition period in Polish politics. So if you could spend a while giving applause to Kasia, to Zbigniew and their team for all the efforts, please. Thanks so much for this. Let me now introduce and invite to the stage our panelists. And we have a truly fantastic group of panelists this morning to discuss the issue. You were listening to Ambassador Verzbel before the coffee break, and it was view from the hill. Now we're gonna listen to those who represent allied countries, as well as our friend from Ukraine. So let me now invite and please welcome Mr. Linas Linkevicius, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lithuania. And please join us on the stage. Mr. Paweł Soloch, the head of the National Security Bureau at the Presidency, at the Chancellor, President of Poland. Mr. Minister. Mr. Andrii Deshchytsia, the Ambassador of Ukraine in Poland, former Foreign Affairs Minister of Ukraine. Please welcome. Damon Wilson, Vice President, Atlantic Council, Washington, D.C., my boss. And Mr. Bogdan Klich, Senator Bogdan Klich, former Defense Minister, Republic of Poland. Please welcome. Let me just add that Bogdan is as a bonus track here, as you don't have him in your agenda. He was happy to join us at the very last minute due to the importance of this session and this conference. Gentlemen, I don't think that we need a deeper introduction on the, actually you were listening to Ambassador Verzbel, and obviously we know what we are talking about, speaking today on the NATO and on the coming summit. We are more or less 14 months after the Wales summit, 8 months ahead of the Warsaw summit, 1 year exactly ahead of the US presidential election, which is also an important fact. And we are observing changes on Polish political scene. We were 2 days after Bucharest meeting, so lots of things happening and are going to happen in coming weeks and months. Instead of introduction, let me just quote the President of Romania, President Klaus Iohannis, at the meeting which happened to, as you know, just 2 days ago. President Iohannis said in his statement, "We don't want NATO to shift attention from the eastern flank anywhere else. We want it to stay focused on this flank, which no matter if it's the first, the second, or 10th item in the news bulletin, is an area of concern for NATO and not just for the countries in the eastern flank of the alliance." That's President of Romania after a very successful meeting, which was in Bucharest earlier this week. With this quote, let me ask you and invite you to deliver your initial remarks on the matter. Mr. Minister, Secretary Stoltenberg was present in Vilnius some 2 months ago, opening the important NATO force integration unit. I would like to ask you for your views on the current status of changes inside the NATO and your expectations ahead. Hope this works well. Yeah.
Hopefully. Thank you very much. Thank you for being able to take part in this conference. Back to Warsaw, always a pleasure to meet old friends. old friends, new friends, and exactly in the course of these important events. I'm also very glad that on the panel my Ukrainian friend, Andrii Deshchytsia, with whom we cooperated, and he was minister, and I was less responsible, but the same charming person. And I believe you will enjoy it. So we really have to take stock of what happened. I believe we have to remind ourselves not only the summit in Wales, which was very successful, and we took right decisions, exactly as the consequence of these decisions were establishing of this FIUs that you mentioned. Also, we decided to have more presence of NATO on ground, in the sea, in the air, especially the eastern flank, which is really a bit disbalanced. As we were discussed some time ago, as we quite remember quite well, that NATO going out of area and out of sight. Now time to be back home a bit, to show that we are here. And frankly speaking, we have to keep the same spirit, the same speed. And I'm really satisfied how these decisions are implemented, not only with regard to FIUs, but also in the context of everything else. But I'd like to remind also Lisbon, when we adopted last time we adopted a new security strategy of NATO, and that was kind of breakthrough, if many of us remember, breakthrough with regard to the Bible of NATO security strategy. It's not Bible because it's changed every 10 years, but nevertheless, we raised to the level of Article 5 two more tasks: crisis management and cooperative security, or partnerships, to say more simple. And there's a lot of discussion, I remember at that time. Really, are we diminishing the role of Article 5? Are we not? At that time, I believe we made the right decision, because NATO is active not only in the wartime, which is, thanks God, not happening, but also in the peacetime. Because if it's not used, it's like a new Ferrari in garage, you know, it's standing, but we have to act and take part in the operation. So why crisis management was mentioned? Because it was really an important decision. And also partnerships. Because partnerships create implicit security guarantees. When partners finding place to discuss with us under the aegis of NATO, it's very important and valuable. We cannot neglect. We must take it very seriously, spend resources, and that was done. But now again, we're coming back to this discussion about relevance of Article 5, about importance, and probably we're coming to the point, I hope all of us will agree, that it cannot be compared with anything else. It's a core article. It must be implemented without any question. We have to think about decision-making procedures, how to make it really efficient, speedy when time needed, and that's, I believe, will focus when the Warsaw Summit is approaching. Also taking stock of what's happened, of course, to continue implement what was decided in Wales, but also to think about practical, pragmatic things. Also, I believe we have to think how to use forces which are situated, deployed in our territories for rotational exercises, for whatever, but they should also act accordingly, and rules of engagement should be defined, and transfer of authorities should be done, and legal basis should be adjusted in order to make them efficient. So a lot of very practical tasks, and I believe we will go accordingly. Also, we have to really increase, improve, deepen our understanding of hybrid threats. No time, and I'm not going to take all time, of course, but just to mention that in Cold War was conventional forces, and even conventional forces Europe Treaty, which was killed, sorry for saying that, but by Russians. But nevertheless, it was not in full capacity responding to the needs to control arms, to control, so to say, even this processes, because it was not included nuclear forces, for instance, naval forces. So we needed something else to be done. And also, we didn't took so much attention to the new asymmetric threats like energy, security, like cybersecurity. Cybersecurity was mentioned, but energy was not. Before 2006 was not existing for NATO, for instance. Now we have centers of excellence by accident, or probably not by accident, but very logically in 3 Baltic states we have centers of excellence in NATO chain of command, dealing with new threats. In Lithuania we have Energy Security Center, in Estonia cyber, in Latvia strategic communications. It's becoming the issue for us to discuss. So situation changed dramatically. We have to review our manuals. What I really have trust in military authorities of NATO, I know that leadership in NATO military authorities, they're taking issue properly. They know what that means. And all these new threats, these hybrid threats, these green men, white trucks, carrying humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, and God knows what they're carrying else. they should be accounted, and we should really adjust our actions accordingly. So these would be short comments, unless you ask something.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Soloch will be speaking in Polish, just in case you need translators. Bardzo proszę, panie ministrze.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. Chciałbym powiedzieć parę słów o spotkaniu w Bukareszcie, jego znaczeniu. No przede wszystkim rzeczywiście było tak, że istniały pewne obawy, że to spotkanie mogłoby dzielić, tak? Ale teraz wiemy, że przede wszystkim po pierwsze była to bardzo dobra dyskusja, po drugie 9 państw flanki wschodniej podpisało deklarację, gdzie wyrażamy wspólne stanowisko wzmocnienia wojskowej obecności NATO, ale jednocześnie, co jest tutaj chyba kluczowe, jeśli chodzi o całość sojuszu, wszyscy podtrzymali solidarność w obliczu wszystkich wyzwań, przed jakimi 28 państw Sojuszu Atlantyckiego staje. Więc hasło NATO 360 stopni tutaj zostało wyraźnie podkreślone. Zresztą sam tytuł deklaracji mówiące o hasło sojusznicza solidarność i wspólna odpowiedzialność w NATO nadaje się na motyw przewodni przygotowań do szczytu w Warszawie. Podsumowując, można powiedzieć tak, że wszystkie państwa flanki wschodniej jasno przedstawiły swoje oczekiwania i to oczekiwania idące w kierunku tego, żeby przyszłoroczny szczyt w Warszawie był decyzyjny, a nie tylko refleksyjny. To bardzo było podkreślane zarówno przez pana prezydenta Dudę, ale też przez prezydenta Johannisa, wszystkich właściwie szefów państw uczestniczących, ale jednocześnie zrobiono to w sposób niekonfrontacyjny. To znaczy bardzo silnie zostało podkreślone znaczenie spójności sojuszu, konieczność poszukiwania szerokiego konsensusu we wszystkich głównych tematach agendy, z uwzględnieniem również zagrożeń idących ze strony południa, nie tylko ze wschodu. Dziękuję.
Bardzo dziękuję. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. So where is NATO today from Ukrainian perspective? And do you still have the full NATO membership in your plans, or this is a far, far away from our today's reality?
From our perspective, NATO is to the west, and but what we would like to have it more in Ukraine than only to the west. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm glad to talk about such an important issue as NATO and security in the region. But I wanted to start with the reflections about the conference that took place 2 days ago in Warsaw about OSCE and the Charter, 25 years Charter of Paris. And during this conference we were talking about the role of the OSCE in the region, particularly in Ukraine and in eastern Ukraine. And everyone agreed that it's a very important institution, and the government of Ukraine has invited OSCE to start to establish the special monitoring mission. However, the OSCE role and the OSCE special monitoring mission is not enough to stabilize situation and to create enough pressure to pressure on Russia to withdraw troops from eastern Ukraine. It's mainly about a platform for talking, for exchanging views, and maybe for monitoring. But the situation has changed, and we need something very really practical and dynamic to react on the security situation that is changing. And it's changing, could change be rather rapidly, as it's happened with the Russian aggression in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. So I think that we have to think about the more interaction between different organizations that are dealing with the security issues between NATO, EU, OSCE, and to create a real ground for stable and consolidated position of those states and those institutions who would like to see the situation in this part of Europe as stable as it was a few years ago. So I think that absolutely those who are saying that we have to talk to Russia and take into account Russian positions are absolutely right, that we have to talk to Russia, but we have to talk to Russia from the position of from the very consolidated position, from the tough position, and we have to convince Russia that every efforts done by international institutions are aimed to stabilize situation and to return to the previous order and not to agree to the rules that Russia is trying to introduce, new rules that Russia is trying to introduce. So I don't think that we have to be afraid of Russia. If we, I'm saying we, meaning that it's Ukraine plus the joint efforts of international community, we were able to stop the Russian aggression, I think that we would be able to convince Russia to build a peace and stability in this region. And I wanted to return to the words said by Ambassador Verzbo yesterday during the dinner, and I would like to cite these words. Ladies and gentlemen, please be ready for more NATO in Poland. What we would like to see in a few years, ladies and gentlemen, please be ready for more NATO in the region, and please be ready in Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Damon, so let's hear the voice from Washington, how you see the current situation, current changes in the alliance, and frankly speaking, is there a high interest now in Washington about Warsaw Summit, about what's next for the NATO? You have your own political season, and is this really what matters these days and shouldn't matter?
Thank you, Michał, and it's just a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Foundation for putting this on. Look, it's crazy season back in Washington as we enter our political climate and our political debates. And if you look beyond the airwaves and the debates that we have in our primary systems, the machinery, the intellectual machinery, the operations of Washington, they are changing, they are moving because something significant and historic has happened. And right now we have a Russia led by Vladimir Putin that is the greatest threat to international security. And it's at ground zero in Europe, and it is challenging the fundamental assumptions and basis of our strategy for European security in NATO. And this is, it's a big deal, it's recognized as such, and getting it right is taking time. So we're actually at a very historic transition point right now, and so it's hard to appreciate the scale of what's happening. It sometimes feels frustratingly slow, although in some cases our response has been quick. But we're going through a fundamental historic transition in our alliance that is actually good for the times. You have to think about what the premise was. This is our strategy for 20, 25 years has been premised on the fact that there is peace in Europe, and yet we have an interstate war in Europe today. It's been premised on the fact that Russia was on track to become a strategic partner of the alliance, and now we have a Russia that has positioned itself as an adversary. And so the beauty of this alliance that we have is that it is a permanent alliance that's about us, that brings us together, and its strength over time has been its historic adaptation to the realities that it faces. And so we are watching an adaptation take place that merely began in Wales. Wales was a first down payment on it. Warsaw has to take a decisive step forward, and that will not be the end of the story. We've seen an alliance that, had with clarity during the Cold War static deterrent defense because of the Soviet threat, that learned painfully slowly that it had to get involved in crisis operations because of all the destruction in the Western Balkans, that understood then an outreach strategy of partnership could help former adversaries become allies. And then we've been focused on all these new threats, cyber, how do we deal with these? Now we're coming back to the fact that we have to integrate all of this, go back to basics and on the deterrent space, but integrate all these elements. And so I think we're on track to look toward the Warsaw Summit. That can it be a summit that basically delivers fundamentally enhanced deterrent strategy for the alliance, while it doesn't give up the more recent NATO role of helping to project stability to our most important strategic neighbors, and to do so in a way that, yes, maintains transatlantic unity, but unity that doesn't mean lowest common denominator. How do we raise the ambition of what we're trying to do? And I think that's what the Bucharest Summit was a little bit about. We need to come out of Warsaw with a deterrent strategy in which there's no doubt about our allied security, and that our adversaries understand the resolve, the capability, and the will that the alliance is mustering to make it clear this is no-go zone. At the same time, what I am concerned about is that we avoid coming out of Warsaw by erecting inadvertently what I've heard others in the region call an Article 5 Iron Curtain that extends from the Gulf of Finland down through the slopes of the Carpathian Mountains to the western littoral of the Black Sea. Nobody wants that, but the inadvertent consequences of what we put in place at Wales protect our own strategy without really knowing what to do in the east or in the south. That strategy by itself will lead to more problems. We can't delude ourselves that our alliance is secure and that we are safe if our neighborhood and our neighbors are on fire. And so I think that's one of the challenges. We're on track because of the efforts of the Poles, the Romanians, and what's happening in Washington right now to really, I think, help get a deterrent strategy right. I'm not sure we're yet on track on understanding how we can project security so that we don't have a permanent gray zone of instability and conflict to the east. The issue with Ukraine, as you asked, Michał, it's not membership. That's a red herring. We shouldn't be talking about Ukraine membership today, because that has shut down a more serious conversation about what we should be doing as the West and as NATO to help bolster a set of capabilities of states that span this eastern flank. An eastern flank that I would argue include the Sweden, Finland, yes, the Baltic states, the NATO allies, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, but also Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, states that have the capacity, the capabilities that create a deterrent bulwark in the east so that they're not tempting targets, they're hardened, and that we've got a way to help strengthen and forge these relationships over the time where we leave no doubt about our commitment to the security of our allies, but without sowing doubt about what Putin could get away with in those countries that are on the other side of the alliance.
Thank you very much, Damon. Senator Klich, can I ask you about the current stage of the implementation of decisions taken in Wales? Where are we today? What's been done? What's not done yet? Yeah.
I would say that that we are almost completing implementation of those decisions, and it means that first they were correct. They were a correct response to the new challenges that we witnessed during recent 2 years, especially in the eastern neighborhood of the alliance. Secondly, that it shows the willingness of partners and allies to go this way that was shaped in the Wales. So we are at the end of the implementation of the Readiness Action Plan. We are at the end of implementation of those decisions that were crucial for as a response and adaptation of NATO to a new security environment in the East. But we are surrounded by the crescent of fire. It was Carl Bildt that described it wrongly as a ring of fire. I would prefer the term of the crescent of fire. And we should remember that the nature of those new threats and challenges from the south and from the east is different. Because when we witnessed recently the more traditional, I would say more conventional threats coming from the new posture of Russia, we witness and we observe asymmetrical threats coming from the southern neighborhood of the alliance. So the West should be prepared during the same time for the response for both, I mean, traditional and non-traditional responses to those challenges. Of course, jihadist organizations cannot directly challenge the West militarily, but they can carry on a series of terrorist attacks on the European and American soil. So the nature is different, but the level of the threat coming from the south is similar to that from the east. Does it mean that we should rewrite our security strategy, security concept that was adopted in Lisbon? I don't think so. It is a long-term period. It needs, let's say, adjustment of security assessment, threats assessment of all the member states. And collective defense, as well as crisis management, is incorporated into the current document. So we should adjust our practice after during the Warsaw Summit to both challenges, not the document, not the strategy. What does it mean to adjust this practice? First of all, I would say that in our interest in the eastern flank of NATO, it is to replace the temporary presence of especially American and allied troops on our territory by the permanent one. Of course, for everybody here at this panel, it is obvious that this is a challenge not for next year, maybe for next years. But we are aware that the provisions incorporated into the Founding Act are not a barrier, that couldn't be overcome during next years if we want to be more secure here in Central Europe. That's first. Secondly, I would underline the necessity of maintaining high level of interoperability of NATO troops. To some extent, we have forgotten about this necessity, but we should take into consideration this level of interoperability that we achieved during, especially during Afghanistan, the operation, ISAF operation in Afghanistan. We should maintain it because interoperability of our forces determines, to some extent, the significance and, let's say, automatic implementation of the Article 5 when needed. Thirdly, we should rework our relationship with our main partners, absolutely enhancing cooperation with such countries as Sweden or Finland, especially Sweden, that contributed much during last years to NATO's operations. Let's take into consideration Unified Protector operation in Libya with a huge contribution from Sweden, and that are more and more close to the alliance. But we should also think about how to rework the concept of cooperative security model, this third essential task incorporated into the security concept, because in fact it failed. It was based on the assumption that the cooperation with Russia could be based on dialogue, not on confrontation. That confrontation is less productive than mutual interest. So we should rework this idea of cooperative security model without changing anything in the strategy concerning especially the cooperative methods and instruments with Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Senator. Minister, if I may come back to our friend and our guest from Lithuania. So we know where we are implementing what happened in Wales. What exactly should we be expecting from the Warsaw Summit? What would Lithuania expect? I'm reading the joint declaration from Bucharest, and the language is pretty straightforward. We understand what we see, but there's no clear word about Eastern flank demanding permanent military presence of the NATO in the region, which was a case and was repeated not only by the Polish politicians. So what are your expectations ahead of the Warsaw Summit? What can be realistically, what can be achieved?
As I said, we have to continue in the same spirit. We have to do even more, and we should not shy ourselves from what we have to do, what should be business as usual. I can remind you some time ago, we were discussing even in NATO that we had no exercises on Article 5 for 10 years, because there were colleagues saying that, look, it's too provocative. That was philosophy, thinking. Now it's not anymore, thanks God, because we have to do what we have to do. It's not provocative to train your troops according to Washington Treaty. And by the way, you should get rid of this philosophy of, creating vacuum of inaction. If one can say that, look, let's not state this because it's too provocative. Let's not do that because it's again too provocative. I would say vice versa. It's provocative if you're not doing right things in time, not too late, but in time. It's provocative. It's like vacuum. It's like vacuum of leadership. And now we see, I will not come too far or too deep, but we see when lack of leadership, it's filled immediately by the leadership of something else. And now we are facing the reality. So NATO must act accordingly, not to be aggressive, but at least to be consistent and to respect our own decisions, frankly speaking. I would like to have really, as we said poetically, more NATO in Ukraine, more NATO. Okay, let's do properly things, and let's not shy away from the permanent stationing, which is so far discussed so sensitively. Okay, I don't care if these troops will be, rotational troops will be for permanent, it's okay, because if terminology will be different, it's fine. But we should have more boots on the ground, because this is the only argument read by the opponents, unfortunately. Statements, they are not mean much, statements, or oral, so to say, arguments. No, this is tangible arguments, and this is not aggression, it's just what we have to do, regardless the propaganda game, regardless of all these talks. And also we should understand that today, unfortunately, I would like to state, Russia is not a partner. It sounds awkward, but this is true. It cannot be partner. It's a factor you should take into account. It's really something where you should waste time and really to be patient, but you cannot be guided by wishful illusions because goals are different. And if goals are different, you cannot have partnership. So you should take this reality on board, aiming in the future to change this nature, definitely, because I have no doubt it will be done, but we should follow our own rules. That was mentioned, rules, It cannot be, the world cannot be guided by rules invented by some country. It should be guided by international law, without any retreatment, without any concessions, because this is a foundation and basis. If we lose this, that will be really problematic. So what I'd like to see, exactly to strengthen these positions, to go consistently, to do what we have to do, to expand the alliance if you want, also to respect partners who deserve to be more respected, to give them more, those who are ready to get more, we should give them more. I have in mind not only Montenegro, which is gaining the way towards possible membership, I also have in mind Georgia to get closer and to do better for them. I have in mind Ukraine, because Ukraine, of course we're not talking, Damon is right, not talking about membership, but we're talking about engagement, we're talking about cooperation, and really to facilitate that process also implicitly will create added value. So partnerships, because it's included into the current NATO security strategy, which is valid. Partnerships are important, so let's pay sufficient attention to the partnerships. And of course, all flanks should be accounted. And we cannot be just one issue, one direction, so to say, concern, because we're talking about Russia, we're talking about aggression of Russia against Ukraine, but we also shouldn't forget southern flank. Of course, we should take into account everything, because interests are mutually related, overlapping. I believe alliance is capable to take these tasks, take these challenges and address properly, because the Wales summit showed that we can take decisions when it's important to take these decisions. So let's not be only be proud about the alliance, but let's also fulfill our own tasks accordingly. And I believe Warsaw summit will be a success, what I really wish to be the case, but also it's not a done deal. We have to make it a success.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Soloch, what Poland is expecting from the Warsaw summit? Obviously, to be proud of the summit and proud to be a host country, but what are our realistic expectations? We all remember President Duda paying his first visit to Tallinn. He stated very openly that we are expecting the alliance to be permanently present in the region, with more of presence, with more of stationary or stationating in the region. So what we say today?
No ja myślę, że oczywiście jeśli chodzi o samą terminologię, to może bardziej zamiast już w kontekście konkretnych decyzji, które mamy nadzieję, że szczyt podejmie, może nie mówmy o nie używaniu słowa permanent, tylko persistent, więc jeśli chodzi o obecność NATO, ja jeszcze raz powtórzę te słowa, które prezydent mówił w Bukareszcie, że celem jest przede wszystkim osiągnięcie decyzji poszerzających to, co żeśmy osiągnęli w Walii. Oczywiście wzmocnienie flanki wschodniej to jest nasz oczywisty priorytet na szczyt, ale on nie wyczerpuje całości agendy. Na pewno jest kwestia, o czym tu już było wcześniej mówione, nowego konsensusu wewnątrzsojuszniczego podejścia do relacji z Rosją. I tutaj stoimy na stanowisku, to zresztą powiedziały również państwa, które były reprezentowane, takie stanowisko państw, które były reprezentowane w Bukareszcie i mamy nadzieję, że takie będzie wspólne stanowisko całego sojuszu, że dialog z Rosją nie może determinować i określać przemianę wewnętrzną sojuszu. To są dwa niezależne elementy, dwa niezależne procesy. To nie może być tak, że wszelkie zmiany, mam tu na myśli przede wszystkim wzmocnienie sojuszu, mają być zakładnikiem polepszania relacji z Rosją. To powinny być dwa oddzielne procesy. No i oczywiście liczymy na to, że na przyszłorocznym szczycie te parametry do kwestii konsensusu nowych relacji z Rosją będą określone. Polityka partnerstw bardzo ważna. Chcielibyśmy, żeby Sojusz na szczycie zaproponował pakiet praktycznego wsparcia dla Ukrainy właśnie, ale także dla Gruzji, Mołdawii. Na pewno oczekujemy nowych odniesień w stosunku do współpracy ze Szwecją i Finlandią. Te dwa państwa, które bardzo, będąc poza sojuszem, ale zwłaszcza w kwestii bezpieczeństwa w obszarze Morza Bałtyckiego są niezwykle aktywne i tutaj współpraca wygląda bardzo dobrze i chcielibyśmy to budować jakimiś konkretami. Impuls dla rozwoju stosunków z Unią Europejską, również w kontekście zwłaszcza tych zagrożeń z południa, które są tutaj, pojawiły się od ponad pół roku. Współpraca, decyzje, deklaracje w zakresie wojskowej wzmocnienia wojskowej obecności NATO. Oczywiście oceniamy bardzo pozytywnie to, co zdarzyło się w Walii, w Newport. Natomiast no, chcielibyśmy, żeby wojskowy wymiar NATO również no, przede wszystkim tutaj na flance wschodniej był wzmocniony. Teraz mówimy o siłach odpowiedzi na poziomie dywizji. Dobrze, docelowo, nie chcę powiedzieć, że ten szczyt najbliższy to rozstrzygnie, ale żeby te siły odpowiedzi były no, na poziomie korpusu. Jeśli chodzi o, tutaj mój poprzednik mówił o ćwiczeniach, manewrach w zasadzie, więc tutaj rzeczywiście dobrze się dzieje tak, że na południu mamy do czynienia z dużymi ćwiczeniami, dużymi manewrami Trident, gdzie wreszcie ten poziom jest dostatecznie wysoki, porównywalny z ćwiczeniami, które przeprowadza Rosja. Dobrze, żeby tego rodzaju manewry były tutaj bliżej na naszym kierunku, więc to są z grubsza rzecz biorąc nasze oczekiwania wobec szczytu. Nie chcielibyśmy na tym etapie określać jakichś danych liczbowych, bo to jest zupełnie przedwcześnie. Oczywiście chodzi nam, tak jak to powiedział prezydent Duda w Bukareszcie, o obecność w konkretnym wymiarze, obecność symboliczna, owo assurance jest oczywiście bardzo ważne, natomiast my byśmy chcieli rzeczywiście obecność wojskową określoną terminem odstraszanie, deterrence i to jest naszym celem.
Thank you, Minister. Ambassador, Mr. Soloch mentioned the package for Ukraine that could be a part of the Warsaw Summit. What should be in such a package? What are you expecting? What are you hoping to get from the alliance? What do you need at this stage of the war against your country?
I think that the mere fact that the summit, NATO summit, will be held in Warsaw shows the NATO involvement in the region, and it shows the importance of this region for NATO, and also shows the importance of the eastern flank for the NATO operations. But it also shows that if I could say, the new members, also Poland is no longer the new member, but still a quite young member of NATO, the importance of these new members of NATO to play an important role in such institutions. So we definitely do not expect membership declarations. We do not expect, also they were already done in Bucharest. We do not expect getting a map, but what we really can expect is more practical cooperation with NATO after the NATO summit. I'm not sure what will be in the package. It has to be discussed, but I think that it's a little bit, we have to go beyond the strategic partnership that we have now with NATO. It's not only partnership, but practical things and practical deeds, and that also we should think about NATO not only in a military sense, but also in political security, rescue, and it's all the things that what training, that all the means that we need now in Ukraine to be introduced into Ukrainian military forces, and we need actually some standards that has to be introduced into the Ukrainian new army, which is evolving, which is establishing right now. And I think if we will have these standards, the NATO standards, without even talking about NATO membership, it would be a good sign for cooperation with NATO members. And if these issues will be discussed, how to help Ukraine to bring these standards into the army would be a very practical practical decision of the NATO summit. And we have such a good way of, an example of good cooperation, which was already established. It's the Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian brigade in Lublin, which could be a basis for such kind of cooperation. And if we pay more attention and pay more attention and more accent on developing such kind of cooperation, it would be a real practical and not only talks and partnership cooperation with NATO. One more thing which is also important to have during the next NATO summit is the invitation of Montenegro for membership to keep the door open.
Thank you, Ambassador. Damon, I want to ask you about the U.S. commitment to the NATO growth. After long years of reducing U.S. military presence in Europe, so what's the mood these days? Is U.S. committed to stop these reductions, further reductions, and instead visibly increase your presence here and on the European soil?
So I think that process is happening, and it's happened with some quick speed on some relatively minor ways after Wales. But the reality is we're sort of turning the ship. We're a superpower with global responsibilities, and as the United States, we don't. There's a lot of talk about pivot, but we actually don't pivot. We've got interest and engagements everywhere, and so we're going to be focused on Asia, on the Middle East, and on Europe. We've got to figure out how to do all of that at the same time, and that's the challenge that we've been going through. It's taken a little while to stop the automatic process we were on, recognizing Europe was a benign security environment. The Europeans were stepping up. Russia was becoming a partner. And so we had extensive force reduction plans in place. We had a reassessment of Russia not as a serious challenge. It takes a while to right that ship. I'm predicting we are in that process. We will get there. It does take some time. And it also, so you've seen some down payment on that. Warsaw will deliver more. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about, we've already made significant progress. Our immediate response was to talk about reassurance of the allies in the East, which I think was an unhelpful construct in some respects because it put an emphasis on our allies' insecurities. We've actually made an intellectual leap that we weren't there at Wales yet to be able to talk about deterrence, which is actually about the mindset of your adversary. And so if we think of it in that regard, deterrence is about the perception of your adversary. There's a psychological aspect. It comes back to credibility. And yes, credibility is absolutely connected to capability. We need to show that we're not continuing massive force withdrawals in Europe. There is a military dimension, conventional, of course, nuclear, defensive side, missile defenses, cyber. But it's also why deterrence, the mindset of our adversary, depends on what we're doing on our resilience agendas in these countries, how we're thinking about intelligence and situational awareness, the speed of our decision making. These things factor into that whole issue, but the most important one is perhaps some of the intangibles. It's a sense of resolve, will, determination. And that affects a political calculus in the Kremlin. And I think that's what's at stake. So even as we focus on what is the alliance going to look like, what are the bricks and mortars in the East, it's a far more complex, and I think we need a far more comprehensive approach to that sense of deterrence. And to be frank, some of the most important things we could do to get this strategy right would be a renewal of sanctions through the EU process with the US backing it up, and more decisive support for Ukraine today. Both of these a little bit beyond the scope of NATO per se, and yet fundamental to an effective deterrent strategy going forward. And I think bringing that together with, yes, the United States has to send that signal of recognizing we're in this for the long term. We can't just sort of temporarily halt our force posture. We need a new force posture review in Europe, which I think is coming, to send the right signals to play this out over time.
Thank you, Damon. Senator, Andrii mentioned the Montenegro. Where are we in our talks with the candidate countries? Is the alliance ready for new members, and who's from the candidate countries may be ready in foreseeable future?
I'm pretty sure that the alliance is ready to adopt Montenegro as the next 29th member of that organization, but I have some doubts concerning deepening our cooperation with the set of important partners. Once again, I will underline that this is one of the crucial challenges for us if we want to continue the model of cooperative security with at least selected partners from Europe and from outside. Yeah? Not only Sweden and Finland, also Ukraine and Georgia. We should be seriously involved in enhancing capabilities and the readiness of our partners in Georgia and Ukraine to be stable partners and stable points on the map. We should reinforce their capabilities and their political elites to maintain this pro-Western course. This is the crucial obligation for NATO, even if we are not ready to adopt Ukraine and Georgia as next members of the alliance. And as a godfather of the idea and the concept, and then the first phase of implementation of Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian brigade, I would say that we should think about the next step. And after completion of technical completion of setting up all the necessary settlements connected with this brigade, we should think about upgrading this brigade into the level of the core. Similar to the core northeast in Stettin, that was one of the crucial channels of communication between Poland and our partners within the alliance before we were introduced into NATO. Let's think about this next step, strategic step, to upgrade the level of this brigade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a couple of minutes left for questions. I think we had the first person there. We have a mic, yes. Please identify yourself, make it really brief, and address it to the specific panelists. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, sirs, for addressing us here today. My name is Renata Zaleska. I have a question to the panel here, but maybe specifically to Mr. Wilson. At the danger of maybe being subversive in terms of the title of the question, the title of the panel, we're focusing exclusively on the eastern flank, but perhaps the eastern flank has now bled into the southern flank with Russian presence in the eastern Med and Syria. And that this may have implications on how we are devising our strategies. A question to Mr. Wilson, being a Washington insider, how do you envision Washington discussions shaping from now until the Warsaw Summit, and how that can impact NATO's agenda then?
Thank you very much. The second question here, gentlemen.
Hi, my name is Reinhard Kuhm. I'm from the German Ebert Foundation. I have one question, actually to all of them, to all of you. In the 60s of the last century, we had a similar difficult situation in Europe. And at the time, NATO came out with the Hamel report. It was concerning security in Europe, and also concerning clearly the Soviet Union. The idea was as much security as necessary and as much engagement as possible. And my question, is that something you're looking at again, or are we in a completely different situation? And how does that play along with the Russia-NATO Council? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Anybody? Oh, sorry. Yes, please. A lady here in the first row.
I'm Mania Tyksza, Eurocloud Europe and Eurocloud Poland, former member of European Economic and Social Committee. A question for all of you, but maybe for the new head of BBN. So the question is, the value of cyber attacks in Europe, it's estimated 290 billion euro. Do you expect at the NATO summit harmonization or only cooperation in the field of protection, new rules, and coordination of the policy, European and American policy in this field? I just add that we have a new European digital strategy with 16 measures, and between them construction of a digital single market, but this digital single market should be protected. And what about that? Thank you.
Thanks so much for this question. So let us address, Damon, would you start?
Sure, just a couple of points. Is this on? Just a couple of points. In response to how the South impacts all this, first, I think it drives home the point that we can't just focus on a strategy about protecting our own. And we have a problem because Russia invaded Ukraine, Libya's collapsing, ISIL's in Syria, in Iraq. These are the fundamental problems. And so, yes, we have to protect our own, but we've got to figure out, as a transatlantic community, more effective Southern and Eastern strategies overall. So that's the first point here. It also means within the alliance that we have to maintain political unity about how we go forward on this. That's why I think there's some approaches within the alliance about how do you focus on the defense capacity building of key neighbors. We've got 60 plus some partners, but the reality is the security of a few of our partners in that crescent of fire are really directly impactful on our security. So can we have some initiatives on partnership on the outreach where we're doubling down? Wales sort of paid a down payment on this issue called defense capacity building. But what if we put it on steroids in a serious way in which we could really deploy more serious capability to help in Tunisia, to help in Ukraine, in a way that would have politically unify the South and the East within the alliance in terms of a common strategy of outreach. But more fundamentally, how are these things connected? And they're connected because of Mr. Putin today and what he's done in Syria. And I think we have to watch out. He has come to learn that we have a short attention span. We hate being in a box where we've got a cold relationship with Moscow. Every time there's a problem with Moscow, what do? We blame ourselves. We look at ourselves introspectively. What do we do wrong? What's wrong with our instruments? That's the trap that he's learned how to get out of over and over again. He has learned very well from issues like Georgia that he can basically sign an agreement, kind of a murky agreement, and as long as there isn't a lot of bloodshed, he can kind of get away with a lot. So the way the South and the East are connected is, will he use this strategic ploy, this ploy in Syria, to change the sort of way of thinking about what we need to do with Russia? The temptation of perhaps unenforceable or even a bad deal vis-a-vis Assad and Syria and how this all can work in a way that, while quieting down, no bloodshed in Ukraine, so undermining the sense of solidarity that we should just continue the sanctions because, after all, maybe Minsk hasn't been fully implemented in the East, but they're playing a more constructive role in Syria and there's no dying in Ukraine. And what do? We find ourselves, Mr. Putin has put himself in a box. I think the sanctions are hurting. I think the long-term fundamentals in Russia are very bad. And I think he's using the dexterity of what's happening in Syria and Ukraine today to, in some respects, manipulate us so that we take the pressure off. And we give him a lifeline and help sustain this authoritarian kleptocratic approach in Russia. And I think that's where they come together. And I think you're going to see some initiatives, some outreach, some tinkering to play a disruptive role, if you will, as we head towards Warsaw, and we should be vigilant for that.
Thank you, Damon. Minister Soloch on cybersecurity.
Tak. Nie wiem, czy tak działa. Jeśli chodzi o cyberbezpieczeństwo, to ono oczywiście wpisuje się w ten rodzaj zagrożeń, łącznie z zagrożeniami wojną hybrydową, na które rzeczywiście, jeśli rozpatrujemy rzecz w kontekście sojuszu, to nie ma w tej chwili przygotowanej tak zdecydowanej odpowiedzi opartej przede wszystkim na mechanizmach reagowania, jak to ma w wypadku tradycyjnych, konwencjonalnych zagrożeń i na pewno chcielibyśmy, żeby ta kwestia znalazła się w agendzie sojuszu. No oczywiście państwa sojusznicze, ale również, tak jak tutaj już pani wspomniała, nie tylko w ramach NATO, ale w Unii Europejskiej współpracują ze sobą, wymieniają się doświadczeniami, ale no z punktu widzenia Polski i naszego własnego wysiłku to jest stanowczo za mało. BBN w poprzednich latach przygotowywało koncepcje związane ze strategią cyberbezpieczeństwa. Chcemy te prace kontynuować. Chciałbym jeszcze nawiązać do kwestii tego rozpięcia sojuszu NATO między wschodem a południem i przyłączyć się do tych opinii, które podkreślają, że opracowanie strategii bezpieczeństwa dla wschodu i dla południa nie może w konsekwencji prowadzić do rozwiązań o sumie zerowej. To nie może być tak, że i stoimy na takim stanowisku, że jedno jest kosztem drugiego. No, na tym polega cała trudność, ale jesteśmy optymistami, wierzymy, że w tym zakresie wewnątrz 28 państw NATO osiągniemy konsensus. Czy sytuacja z Rosją przypomina lata zimnej wojny? No myślę, że jednak chyba nie, ze względu na znacznie mniejsze możliwości, chociaż wciąż istotne Rosji w porównaniu z czasami Związku Radzieckiego. Jednak rzeczywiście obecność Rosjan w Syrii no, nosi takie znamiona podjęcia przez to państwo globalnej gry. Pytanie, czy będzie w stanie tą grę prowadzić. Powrót do tego samego poziomu relacji i dialogu z Rosją, tak jaki miał miejsce przed agresją wobec Ukrainy, przed aneksją Krymu, no wydaje się, że do czasu rozwiązania właśnie tej kwestii aneksji Krymu i relacji z Ukrainą, no nie wydaje się możliwy, chociaż oczywiście dialog jakiś powinien być kontynuowany. Dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister, just very briefly, as we're running out of time now, the question from our German guest, if this time is different or we saw it all before?
Every time is different, you know, but the approach was, we're always putting emphasis on engagement, but we're forgetting that was another part to improve capabilities, resilience, and then go to that's important to remember. And also, as I said, there's no partnership here, just some other channels of communication needed to provide, to send the message, proper message. And very briefly on other aspects, very briefly, as it was said, Syria, what happened in Syria, what happened in Ukraine, different conflicts, but similarities, the methods are the same, creating conflict, frozen conflict somewhere, and then through that controlling the situation. So this is also something should be learned by lessons which not learned by us. Not learned in South Caucasus in 2008, so it was repeated and will be repeated if we'll not take it properly. And one more last sentence, it was a question about digital strategy, single market. I'd like to say the key of our capabilities, of our efficiency, of our power, the power of our values, value-based approach, it's transatlantic unity. If we'll be split, if we'll not engage with each other, which will not coordinate our efforts, we really will fail. So I hope we will not do that.
Thank you, Minister. The last word to Senator Klich. As a representative of the Polish opposition, you have the last word here.
Since the next week. Together with Roland Freudenstein, sitting in the second row here, we had the chance to attend the Herzliya conference last year. It was just after the let's say, the final phase of the military intervention of Russian Federation in Donbass. And Sergei Karaganov at that time threatened us, I mean the West, threatened us that there is a beginning of the second phase of the Cold War. You remember, Roland, this famous discussion. It was, of course, not the only threat that comes from Moscow. That there will be, or there is, the beginning of the new phase of the Cold War. I don't think so. I don't think that Russian Federation is ready to do that because of capabilities, the lack of ideology, and the lack of alternative economic system that could be compared, at least at the beginning, with the liberal economy in the West. But anyway, we will witness for years, I suppose, the competition with Russian Federation because President Putin will not be ready to abandon his doctrine that he expressed so clearly just after the illegal annexation of Crimea. So we will observe the readiness of Russian Federation to protect with military means Russian-speaking minorities in neighboring countries, or the threat of that. We'll see the involvement of Russian Federation troops also in the other places, not only in surroundings of Russia, like in Syria. And we will see the militarization of foreign policy of that country as we could see during last several years. So what to do with this network of communication that we worked together with Russian Federation during last 20 years, I mean NATO-Russia Council, it should be suspended. It should be suspended. It should exist, but it should be suspended as long as President Putin doesn't return, to the basic pillars of the cooperating model of security. This is my response.
Thank you, Senator. Well, I wanted to close this session with the optimistic message, and I failed. I blame you as the opposition in Poland. There's always a problem with the opposition, whoever in opposition is. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists today.